So, when we talk about healing from abandonment, right, what does that actually mean? And what is abandonment actually even referring to? Right? I've spoken about, healing abandonment wounds or what is abandonment, what is emotional abandonment, what is emotional neglect, what does it actually look like? And today I'm going to be talking about different ways that we experience abandonment or different ways that we experience grief as human beings on this planet. If you're a human being with a pumping heart and a soul and a mind and a body, then you've experienced some kind of grief at some point in your life. And the more successfully and the more clear we are in understanding what grief is and the emotions that we are experiencing as we move through those phases of processing grief, the better able we are to, engage in the phases that we're in with less shame, less confusion, and more successfully embrace life after grief or after pain or after hurt. So when we talk about grief, grief, sometimes people think about as like loss, losing someone physically, right? The death of a loved one. But as we know, grief has many other forms that come into being. And abandonment has many forms as well. It's not always about the baby who's left outside the fire station. But grief and abandonment could be talking about, or neglect can be themes that are less tangible, right? We can grieve the loss of a relationship. We can grieve the loss of a job opportunity. We can grieve the dreams that we thought we once had, the possibilities in a certain relationship that never will be, right? We can feel left by our social group. We can feel isolated and misunderstood by people who we thought would understand us. We can feel disappointed in our relationships with people in our lives, in our own selves, or even in sometimes like a disconnect in, your sense of spiritual belonging or connecting to your higher power or your God. And the reason I'm bringing this up is because grief and abandonment or neglect or loss are not things that are eternal. It's not like you're putting a gravestone on something and then it's gone forever. Even with death, right? There's always that person's spirit. There's always a relationship that lives on, and there's a connection and there's a life lesson. So when something has changed, it doesn't mean that then we go into this despair and we stay stuck there. There's a way of actually moving through and with grief, through and with pain, through and with trauma, through and with loss that helps us evolve as human beings because we all have work to do on this planet. If you're on this planet, there's a reason you're here. And if you are extra attuned or extra sensitive or extra aware, then you might even be more attuned to what's going on. So abandonment is something that it's a universal word. Everybody is afraid of it. Grief is usually connected to some kind of abandonment, some kind of loss. And it's a primal fear, right? We all have a fear since we all want with the sense of security, we all want safety. It's a primal fear to not want to be abandoned. And abandonment, like I said, could be having to move neighborhoods because your family has, a medical situation they have to address. It could be going through a loss of a marriage, a relationship. It could be suffering the loss of a close connection with a friend, with a community leader, with position at your work, things like that, right? And so these are the steps that we usually look at when there's abandonment, when you're facing feelings of kind of being left alone, left behind, and wanting to move through it. So, like I said, it's like having a loss of love, having a sense of not belonging. When you go through a trauma, your self-esteem can, really be diminished, and many times you might feel kind of disappointed. So there's 5 steps, and the term for it is swirl, and swirl is like shutting down, shattering. Now, step number 1 is shattering. Step number 2 is withdrawal. Step number 3 is internalizing. Step number 4 is rage. And step number 5 is lifting. And I'm going to obviously write more about this in the blog linked below, but just to give you an overview, this is what it naturally looks like. The first one is called shattering. So shattering comes along with this initial shock, right? Somebody gives you bad news, someone who you've been dating for a while kind of ghosts you, there's an opportunity or there's a trauma where you feel kind of abandoned or hurt or violated or isolated. So it's kind of like this sudden disconnection and this despair, and you're kind of in this phase of just overwhelm, and you're kind of just feeling shattered all over the place, and you're more in a shock. The second thing is called withdrawal. Withdrawal is basically when you have something And something that happened, you're suddenly in the next phase where you're starting to gather your senses and you're noticing withdrawal from it. So your withdrawal of a sense of love, withdrawal of a sense of stability and structure, right? You're craving what you had. You're longing, you're needing somebody or something, a certain routine, certain reassurance, a certain sense of security. What you might notice sometimes is like a feeling of separation anxiety, right? Like separation anxiety from the role you had, separation anxiety from the relationships that you've had. You might notice like a restlessness, like your body is kind of feeling the withdrawal when people go through drug withdrawal. And like your day-to-day routine might feel almost like a daily pain management. How do I manage the pain? And it's an excruciating process to be in. The next phase that usually happens is internalizing. Internalizing means that you're internalizing the anger about what happened towards yourself. So many times when our anger cannot be expressed outward, or there isn't a space to make sense of what happened, we turn the anger towards ourselves. It's an attempt to make sense of and to feel a sense of power. So internalizing anger is kind of like, I can't believe this happened. I'm so mad at myself. Now, usually that internalization turns into depression because if we batter ourselves up all day, we are going to turn depressed, okay? And it usually turns towards like, I'm not good enough, right? It might come, you might have like intrusive insecurities that start coming up, right? All of these like self-demeaning comments and really just feeling down on yourself, right? So it's going from the shattering, the withdrawal, and then the internalizing as a sense to try to make sense of something. The next phase is rage, and rage is not necessarily a bad thing, but a part starts realizing like maybe it's not all about me. Maybe there's a space for me to, yes, have adequate and appropriate anger and rage, which is a healthy emotion when there's loss, when there's grief. It could be rage at the world, rage at a certain social group, rage at just having to experience a loss, right? The loss of a child, the loss of if somebody has a child with certain special needs or developmental needs, the loss of a financial security, the loss of a certain safety when there's dishonesty in a relationship, right? A certain sense of vulnerability, right? When there's change in life. So there's a lot of rage that's appropriate, healthy rage that's basically saying, I'm not okay, this is not okay. And then helping that be expressed. And then the last phase is lifting, right? Lifting is basically as you're going through like the shattering, the withdrawal, the internalizing, the rage. Then finally, as your body's moving through that, there's this sense of lifting, of like the intensity starts lifting. A part of you starts feeling like, who am I? What's left to me after all of this that everything has been going through in my mind, in my body, in my soul? There's empty spaces, but there's also space to maybe start breathing, thinking, hoping again. And the intensity starts lifting, and you can start making sense of, who are you after the impact? Who are you as you digest the trauma, the loss, the self-esteem that has taken a hit, or the lack of, security and sense of safety that you had. So these are the steps, and obviously I'm going to go more into detail about what this might look like when you're going through grief. And like I said, grief can happen across so many different spectrums, across so many different kind of situations. Grief is a universal concept, specifically connected to abandonment. And abandonment is at the core of every single one of us human beings because we all don't want to ever be abandoned. But most of us have been through some kind of abandonment, some bigger and some smaller. Okay? And the more we're able to understand when we're grieving, and the better we're able to acknowledge there's 5 phases. Which one am I in? What are some tips that I can do while I'm in each of these phases? The more successfully you'll navigate and move through the toughness and actually, get to the phase of lifting more smoothly and then be able to kind of like charge yourself forward into your next phase, whatever that might look like, as a wiser, more wholesome being. Because none of us can leave and go through this life unscathed, but what we can do is experience life and really strengthen ourselves and get to know ourselves on a much deeper level. So this is for any or all of you who have ever felt kind of left behind, left alone, down on yourself, or just experienced confusing emotions. This is for you, and in my blog I will be also addressing different kinds of, abandonment, losses, even when there's a lot that you have in your life. Sometimes there's emotional abandonment or neglect. So you might have some of these experiences, and maybe this will help you understand why you're going through them and giving yourself permission to grieve appropriately as you move forward and having more meaningful, more secure, and more fulfilling relationships, first with yourself and then with others. So remember the acronym SWIRL, and I I invite you to read the blog for more tips for yourself.